Turns out we got access to the buggy mess that is Crimson Desert at the same time as Intel's Arc GPU team. Crimson Desert was a nightmare to test on launch day. We didn't get early access, so we started right when the game came out, which included a day zero patch that had some launch optimizations included in our tests. We immediately ran into problems. Across both NVIDIA and AMD and across 3 different test systems, we experienced various game freezes, full system shutdowns, crashes to desktop, and whatever the fuck this is, available in both pink and yellow. Fortunately, unlike NVIDIA and AMD, Intel didn't have any of these problems with its Arc GPUs. That's because you can't use them to play this game, because Pearl Abyss refused to work with Intel throughout the development process, including Intel offering Pearl Abyss early hardware and early drivers. We'll talk about that as well. So they are probably working on a solution on the weekend right now, because they got it when everyone else did. Beyond the bugs, draw distance issues, and pop-in problems, and general noisiness in the game's graphics, we did actually manage to run 25 GPUs through testing in a span of just 10 hours. So a huge thanks to my team for pushing through that with me. It's also our first gaming benchmark debut of our recently detailed simulation time error testing methodology. We're using Crimson Desert to test for issues in game object motion separately from frame rate and frame time in charts like this. We had a lot to balance here between trying to turn this around as fast as possible to help as many people, as relevant as possible for the game's launch, while also wanting to benchmark a ton of GPUs, debut our simulation time error, previously known as animation error methodology. Really super excited about that, by the way. These are the first kind of like real charts that we've done for it. And also trying to test the different settings, the different areas of the game, all that stuff. Now again, we didn't have early access, so this is the launch version of the game, including its first patch. We ended up going with 25 GPUs, including the GTX 1080 Ti, 1070, and 1060. We ran 3 resolutions, every settings option on a couple GPUs, and then we tested across several hours of gameplay, including some distant towns and environments, just to make sure we understood if the game's performance changed later on the game. So I'm not too familiar with the world of Pywell, I'm gonna go with. I hope I got that right. I'm gonna make some very mad Black Desert, now Crimson Desert players if I don't. So we went later into the game as well and tested that. So this is in addition to the new charts. We've got a lot to go through. Let's get into it. Before that, this video is brought to you by Arctic and their MX7 thermal paste. Arctic's new MX7 is a higher viscosity paste, with Arctic claiming that the increase in viscosity from filler content and the texture benefit improve its performance while reducing the risk of the pump-out effect over time. MX7 is intended for longer endurance applications and to be left in use for extended service life. Arctic also now has a counterfeit paste checking website because, believe it or not, knockoff paste from non-first-party sources is actually relatively common for the big brands to experience, so they have a site to check the validity of it. Get a tube of Arctic's MX7 thermal paste at the link in the description below. So for testing, we're using our GPU Reviews test bench. It's a 9800X3D. It's slightly overclocked just to maintain a level clock without any fluctuations. And then we started as soon as the game came out, which means we have all of the contents up at the launch time onward. And I stayed up all night running benchmarks. Then we're playing Crimson Desert. I don't know if we don't know if this is where it gets the name Crimson from.
This is AI NPC detection.
It's AI NPC detection?
Yeah. See? This kind of looks like Marathon, actually.
DLSS 5 looks really good. The team came in the morning and relieved me of my duty for testing, so thank you to the team for that. The game works really well.
Did it die again?
Yeah.
Shit.
This time I got it though. And then we got this together. We're gonna start with some of the bugs we ran into, then we'll go into the charts. We've got a bunch of research here as well for how the game performs across combat, non-combat situations, wandering in the town, all kinds of stuff, so we can get a full picture of how does this game perform. And I guess if you wanna talk about things like pop-in, we've got a little bit of that too, just because it's not really a graphics-focused deep dive, but there was some stuff that we just couldn't help but notice and talk about. As we got into Crimson Desert testing, we ran into the fun part. Tons of bugs that seemed to be from the game rather than the drivers. The issues occurred on both AMD and NVIDIA, with one exception, which was the drivers. Intel's GPUs just don't work. Crimson Desert rejected the B580 when detected and told us that it can't be used to play the game. We asked Intel for its driver support plans, and the company informed Gamers Nexus that Pearl Abyss did not work with or enable Intel to work on drivers in advance of the game's launch, meaning they got access the same time as the public did. Intel stated, quote, "We're aware that Crimson Desert currently doesn't launch on systems with Intel GPUs, and we're hugely disappointed that players using Intel graphics hardware can't jump into the world of Pywell at launch. Getting games running smoothly is a partnership between developers and hardware makers. Over the past several years, we've reached out to Pearl Abyss many times to help test, validate, and optimize support for Intel graphics, providing early hardware, drivers, and engineering resources across multiple generations, including Alchemist, Battlemage, Meteor Lake, and Lunar Lake. Our teams are deeply committed to helping all studios deliver the best experience possible, providing open tools, documentation, and direct engineering support to make sure their games run well for everyone, including the tens of millions of players using Intel GPUs. We remain ready to assist Pearl Abyss however we can. For details on the choice not to enable Intel support at launch, please reach out directly to Pearl Abyss," end quote, which is about as direct as you can get from Intel. And we did just ask one more clarifying question. If Intel's between the lines comment here is that Pearl Abyss didn't grant Intel access before launch, Intel's representative stated, quote, "Correct. Pearl Abyss did not provide early access to game codes," end quote. So Intel here is really getting screwed and boxed out, especially if they're providing hardware and drivers to Pearl Abyss. Seems kind of one-sided at that point. The fact that based on what Intel has written here, several media publications had access to this game before Intel did also is bizarre. Either way, Intel is probably working on this now, but it sounds like they basically got a start at the same time as we started benchmarking, which would have been 6 p.m. on launch day Eastern time. So anyway, that's the news on the Intel stuff. But there's more. We also had issues with hard crashes, and not just to desktop. We had two machines that separately experienced a complete shutdown of the system from Crimson Desert. One was a 1080 Ti, and the other was an RX 7800 XT. It's possible that there was some other issue on the 1080 Ti system, so we assumed it was unrelated. However, it then happened again on the 7800 XT card and in a completely different computer that hasn't ever had any problems with this before. This is like our most stable bench platform we have. We also had regular issues with all moving objects in the scene being rendered suddenly with pink boxes around them, resembling maybe hitboxes or something similar to that. We occasionally saw these with yellow boxes as well, but generally they'd randomly appear and disappear, and we saw these on both AMD and NVIDIA. It was not every single time. I think it happened maybe 4 or 5 times during our testing of all these cards. On a few instances, we had the game lock up and freeze without completely shutting down the system, though we could kill the game with Task Manager. Still shouldn't happen, and all that's just what we found in the test session. The game seems half-baked and not ready for launch, as there should never be any hard shutdowns or game freezing issues. And that's just sticking to the bugs. There's other problems too, like one thing we noticed was the loading in the game is painfully slow in some situations. You have to sit through a minute or more of loading animation, and this is on machines with reasonably fast SSDs as well, so it does just seem to be slow with loading. Pretty painful when you're changing settings a lot, because that requires closing the game and reopening it for every settings change to make sure there's accuracy, and that means a lot of loading. We won't get too into this part, but we also noticed that pop-in is extremely bad in this game. You can see small elements like grass and plants popping in just 5 feet in front of the character. At that point, it's more distracting to have the objects pop in there than to just not have them at all. The same is true for objects in the background and the midground, where even the highest end of systems at hundreds of frames per second with overhead available to draw more things farther away, they're not given the ability to extend the draw distance. We couldn't find any options for this in the settings. We weren't able to find a way to do this in the configuration file from just a quick look. It's possible someone's found a way to do that by now, but this seems like a likely mod in the future. Not really sure why they've limited the draw distance in this way, but the pop-in is just really distracting. And that's just, in general, the game just has a lot of kind of shimmery noise all over the place. And there's ways to try and deal with the noise in the graphics settings, but there's nothing we could find to do about the pop-in. This next section goes over our research for designating a test area candidate. The point of this is to find something that's representative of play at large in general, without being something that's difficult to replicate like combat would be. For this process, Patrick and I played the game for a couple hours each and wandered around, including to some outer areas near Demonis, the circus estate, and near the first town of Hernand. And I hope I'm pronouncing these things correctly. We don't test with headphones on. So we manually capture these and assign names to each, with the point being that we want to learn and understand how the game performs in different situations before committing to a test scenario. Here's the result with the 5060 Ti 16GB, which we used because we wanted something that was a moderate performer, not too high end, not too low end, but also modern. This is at 1440p, and like most of our testing, we do not use upscaling of any kind unless it's noted separately. The range is huge for the lows, where some situations resulted in heavy hitching and stuttering. Primarily, we noticed these during what seemed like invisible loading sequences when changing from one outdoor cell to another, such as crossing the bridge on the horse early in the game when you first get the horse. Lows dropped to 12.5 FPS during this brief sequence when we looked out over the environment around the area, leading to temporary brief stuttering when at 1440p Ultra without RT enabled. This is in spite of a good average at nearly 70 FPS. And just as a note, the gameplay capture we're showing you is separate. It is not the same thing. We isolate the gameplay capture from the benchmark capture, so there's no influence on the data, and then we don't run external capture during testing just for a lot of reasons. So the footage you see throughout this is captured separately from the performance numbers. We also observed this behavior in our Inner City Roaming 3 test sequence, where we walked from the lowest part of the Hernan's Castle outer town to the castle gates. We saw a drop to 21.6 FPS for the lows, despite a great average frame rate. The 1% lows also suffer here at 40 FPS. The real problem is the disparity between the average and the lows, with that gap being noticeable. Most of the rest of the results are relatively consistent. The 1% lows are still more distant from the average than we see in some other games, but the 0.1% lows and 1% lows are mostly near each other, which is good. The range for average FPS here was nearly 28 FPS average, from 77 FPS in the fields to 49.8 FPS in one of the fights. That's a large range. The average of all scenes measured when removing things like black screens or menu pauses, things like that, spans a few hours of gameplay and was 67 FPS. Our final test candidate was in a city, which averaged 70 FPS. This is higher than the overall average, but it's the most consistent run-to-run for testing that we could find, while still being real damn close to the overall average we had, which again was 67. Areas that are lower than this in any meaningful way often involve combat, which is not repeatable run-to-run. Here's a frame time plot for that bridge scene, where we have a long-range visibility. Everything looks fine if you truncate the scale to 50 milliseconds, with frame-to-frame consistency overall good. That frame rate itself is also okay. It's faster than 60 FPS. But it's really the consistency of the pacing that we care about. The problem emerges at the end, where we countered, honestly, one of the most impressive frame time spikes I have ever seen, and not in a good way. The chart now shows the worst frame time spike that, at least to my memory, we've plotted in years. It jumped up to 691 milliseconds for one frame. That means that we were staring at the same frame for nearly an entire second without any kind of movement. Enough for you to think that the game is going to imminently crash. It recovered, but it was a hard stutter here. This doesn't repeat in the same spot every time, but it does happen just generally, occasionally, during play on some of these GPUs. The 5060 Ti was holding a 13 to 15 millisecond frame time on average here, which is, again, greater than the 60 FPS that plot at 16.667 milliseconds. So it's not like the frame rate was bad, but that spike definitely was, and this isn't a one-off. This again, it occurs just kind of randomly throughout play. It seemed like it tended to be when you maybe load or dump a cell as you transition around the map or something. Here's the same in-game scaling chart for the 9070 XT now. The range for average FPS is about 39 FPS from 115 FPS to 77 or so. The 0.1% lows range from 99 FPS to 19, or about 80 FPS for the actual range top to bottom of that at 0.1%, which is crazy. The 9070 XT experienced the worst performance during a loading screen to the campfire, but fortunately that's not an area where you need responsive controls because it's a loading screen. You technically can move the mouse, but it doesn't really matter. In terms of actual play, we had some hitches when walking to the cabin, but otherwise this card was much more stable for its frame interval pacing at 1440p than the weaker 5060 Ti. The average for all tests for this card was 96 FPS across couple hours of play. The test candidate that we approved for its reliability and consistency averaged 100 FPS, so it's about 4 FPS higher than the global average, which we think is a representative match while still being repeatable, unlike combat, which is not repeatable run-to-run. Our next section was also part of our early research. For this, we went through and tested various presets in a fixed test path. Unless otherwise noted, we did most of this without modifying any graphics presets and while keeping upscalers. The purpose of these quick tests is to understand what our scaling is and help quickly choose a preset for baseline testing. We tested from minimum to max presets, plus RT toggled on and off with max including cinematic mode, maximum lighting, ray reconstruction, and DLAA. Technically, max isn't its own preset, but that was us toggling the rest of the things all the way up. DLAA was not used for any other settings. Minimum looks like a fuzzy, blurry, muddy mess and is hardly playable. We still tested it, but it really doesn't look good. Cards that are otherwise insufficient can technically run this. It's just not a good experience. This, though, is how they can technically say on their sheets that they can accommodate something like a 1060. It's with this setting. Here's the chart with the 5060 Ti with FPS values shown. The 5060 Ti ran at 151 FPS average with 1440p minimum, which looks awful. That's an improvement on the low settings 91 FPS average of 65.7%, so this is where you would gain the most performance. But again, it really, it's subjective. It's up to you. You can do whatever you want. Personally, I wouldn't play this game on minimum. I'd rather not play it. It looks that bad to me. But if you can deal with it, then great. More power to you. Medium ran at 74 FPS average here, so low is better by 24%, but obviously it looks much worse. High has a performance cost about the same as medium, with the two indistinguishable in performance of this test. Ultra without RT consistently ran a couple frames per second average faster than Ultra with RT. That's why we chose to disable RT for most of our tests. It's almost no impact on the frame rate performance, and we wanted to maintain maximum compatibility for older cards. So the 1080 Ti was high on my list for wanting to run for this. Disabling RT ensures we can do that without any issues. Since RT on versus off performed about the same on both AMD and NVIDIA, we toggled it to better accommodate those without hardware RT support. Cinematic is the next large drop in performance down to 62 FPS average. Ultra performs about 12% better with RT on than that. Enabling max lighting, which is not part of any preset, drops cinematic massively for performance. It falls from 62 FPS to 37 FPS average. Finally, max lighting, cinematic presets, and RT reconstruction with DLAA ran at 18.4 FPS. This is on a 5060 Ti, remember. We also ran this on a 5090 and it was playable. Here's the same for the 9070 XT, although we didn't run minimum for this one. Top to bottom, there's a total range of 38 FPS average in these results in a like-for-like test. That's about the same range as we saw game-wide leaving this area. Medium and high don't really offer much from each other in terms of performance differences, just like last time with the 5060 Ti, and high and ultra are also close together. Toggling RT with ultra showed about a 3.6% uplift with it off. For Ultra versus Ultra, so not enough to warrant leaving it on for benchmarking purposes, as again, it would cause concerns for things like the 1080 Ti for like comparisons that we really wanted to include. Up next is simulation time error. This is actually really cool. We previously ran a white paper piece doing a big research deep dive on this stuff. It's a new type of metric that we present with new types of testing, and we used to call it animation error, but we've gone back to simulation time error just to reduce confusion. So this is when there's a mismatch between the pace at which the frames are shown and the events that are shown in those frames. It's our attempt to quantify a feeling, basically, how the game feels. You can have a smooth frame rate on paper, but if the images you're seeing don't line up with that rate, the game may feel stuttery or laggy anyway, and it's not the same as frame times. This can be a different problem. The opposite is also true, where you could stagger frames chronologically to make movement look correct, but end up with a bad frame rate number. Those are the theoretical extremes. In practice, higher frame rate equals better the majority of the time, subjectively. We're adding these animation error charts for a little more nuance, though. Let's get into it. First, here's an example of what we'd consider healthy frame times and simulation time error, which we previously called animation error. We've renamed it to reduce confusion from popular demand for this better name. This is a plot of the test pass that we call Abyss Puzzles Part 1 on the 5060 Ti. This logged for nearly 3 minutes straight at an average of 69 frames per second, derived from an average frame time of 14.5 milliseconds. This is during actual gameplay as well. As you can see on the plot, frame times never deviated significantly from the 14.5 average, which is good. Simulation time error wasn't 0, which is technically ideal, to be 0 that is, but it was rarely greater than 4 milliseconds in either a positive or negative direction. In our experience thus far, this is not a bad result. We see a few greater excursions that align with the frame time spikes, such as around the 5700 second mark, where frame time spiked to about 19 milliseconds, and simulation error jumps to plus or minus 4 milliseconds. The frame time dip around frame 8000 to about 12 milliseconds aligns with an increase in frame rate. Normally that would be seen as a good thing. However, because it's inconsistent with its immediate neighbors, it would actually have been better to hold a worse frame rate for a higher frame time, which would result in a better or smoother experience. We can also see this in the simulation time error data. Simulation time error gets more scattered as well towards the back quarter of this chart, but so do frame times. We've adjusted the vertical scale for this plot of the Inner City Roaming 3 test pass on the same card. There's a clear individual frame time spike up above 60 milliseconds, so again some inconsistency issues. This is also reflected in our usual 1% and 0.1% load calculations, alongside a predictable up and down simulation time error deviation, here showing minus 82 milliseconds and plus 63 milliseconds at the same time. More interestingly, there are some big simulation time error deviations that appear alongside smaller frame time spikes. For example, the final frame time spike is to 26 milliseconds, but simulation time error bounces down to minus 39 milliseconds and up to 19 milliseconds, followed by a couple of rippling smaller deviations. These are situations where the 1% and 0.1% numbers might not look that bad in a bar chart, but the subjective feel of the game is significantly worse than the numbers would indicate. In fact, they wouldn't even look that bad in a frame time plot, other than the couple excursions here. It's situations like this why we added simulation time error testing, defined in our animation error methodology white paper by its previous name. Pretty cool though to see it at work in one of our first public use cases outside of that white paper we published. Finally, here's an example of an actual test pass on the GTX 1070, a venerable card. The frame times are high, but they're consistent, which means we won't see a wide gap between the average and the lows on our usual FPS bar chart. Simulation time error reflects what we actually felt though as a player, rather than what we're told about frame time pacing. What we felt was a laggy and sluggish unresponsiveness to inputs. Almost every frame has a significant simulation time error value, and there are consistently frames that deviate 30 milliseconds or more from zero. The scattered nature of the simulation time error dots and the wide variability in the values makes it easy to spot just by the chart that this is a bad experience. Despite a technically smooth frame time pacing, it just doesn't feel good when you're playing the game. Even if the numbers otherwise look okay, it is a slow frame rate, but the pacing looked okay. This is another great example though for when our simulation time error testing methodology can highlight something hidden by both frame rate and even by frame times. For comparing simulation time error across GPUs, we have a couple choices. The most straightforward is to take the total of all sim time errors for each frame, specifically the absolute values, and then divide that by the total of all frame times, which should always be almost exactly 40 seconds for these tests. That gives us a number for the average error per frame. This chart doesn't exactly follow the frame rate performance stack, but it's in the ballpark. Cards like the 5090 and 7900 XTX have relatively low error per frame, while the 2070 and 2060 KO are on the other end of the chart. And the 1070 is massively worse in a ridiculous way here. In the most simplistic way, this chart orders simulation time error from best to worst. Many of the devices are functionally tied, which is why you see the 9070 XT, 4090, 5090, and 5070 all the same. Unlike frame rate, this metric is typically either bad or not, as opposed to frame rate where there's more of a sliding scale or gradient. However, during our discussions with Intel's Tom Peterson, we brainstormed a way to represent simulation time error per frame relative to frame times. The reasoning is that, for example, 1 millisecond of error is arguably more significant relative to a 6 millisecond average frame time than it is to a 12 millisecond average. This doesn't make for a very exciting chart at the top end, since on nearly every GPU we tested, the percent sim time error was between 2% and 3%. The 1070 was again a huge outlier at 11.9%, and the 5090 FE, likely because of its extremely high performance with more of a risk of occasionally bouncing off of other limitations as well, lands at 3.8%. Now, in some situations, this might be enough to have some perceived stuttering or lag, but in this case, the 5090 averaged 186 FPS in this test, which is high enough to help offset the issues. For the GPU comparison charts with standard FPS, 1%, and 0.1% lows, we'll start with 1080p Ultra with RT disabled. Remember that Ultra in this game is more like high in most games, as cinematic takes the place of Ultra, and the proximity of high results to Ultra is relatively close, and medium to high is even closer. In the 10 hours that we tested this before going into production, we managed to test 25 GPUs across 3 resolutions with 2 additional resolution and settings tests, plus the simulation time error testing and everything else you're seeing here. Without early access, we filled this chart in as best we could. We'll start with the interesting numbers. The GTX 1060 6GB is technically supported by the game. For these settings, it's not playable, but nearly 20 FPS average isn't as bad as it sounds for the old 1060. you could play on lower settings. It's just not a good experience. And because we're trying to pack in as many cards as we can, we're focusing on the directly comparable numbers here rather than kind of tuning for each individual card. The more interesting way to look at this and the 1070 would be with relative scaling numbers. The GTX 1070 leads the 1060 by 17%. Even more interesting is that owners of the GTX 1080 Ti, 36 FPS for Ultra really isn't bad. You could drop to low if you needed to and do some settings tuning to make this workable. It's also interesting since users who sprung for the 1080 Ti could still reasonably get some life out of it yet. And comparing to 1060 and 1070 scaling, this 1080 Ti has managed to hold on a little bit longer. The 2060 KO outdoes it though, benefiting from its more modern hardware and running at 45 FPS average. And to go through the 60 class cards, the 2060 to 3060 is showing a 23% improvement. Then the 3060 to 4060 posts a 19% uplift, with the 4060 to 5060's 82 FPS average at a 24% uplift. Other popular cards of the past include the RTX 3070, posting an 81 FPS average in this configuration and sitting between the 2080 Ti and 5060. The 3080 remains popular and held 105 FPS average with good lows. Actually, overall, the low scaling is relatively consistent across the stack. Looking to AMD now, the 9070 XT ran at 123 FPS average, with the 9070 immediately below it. The 7900 XTX outdoes the 9070 XT in this title by 24%, sitting between the 5070 Ti and the 5080. The 9070 GRE that we found in China and recently reviewed in a separate video ran at 96.5 FPS average, about the same as the 5060 Ti. And the 9070 GRE was a really interesting card. A lot of people didn't catch that review, but you should go on the channel. It's a couple weeks back and check it out. It is an interesting one. As for the 9060 XT, predictably that was just below the 9070 GRE at 88 FPS average. Let's move on to the next chart. At 1440p, the 5090 has some of its performance shaved off from the 208 FPS average at 1080p to 186 FPS average here, which shows that we are GPU bound, so that's useful data. Some cards fall off the chart due to poor performance from their age. The 1070 remains now at 18 FPS average, which is really only useful as an academic point for scaling purposes. The 1080 Ti isn't quite hitting 30 FPS average here, so that's struggling as well. You can always play at lower settings, but 1080p helps most for these cards in particular. Up at the top, the 7900 XTX is the closest competition from AMD to NVIDIA's 5070 Ti and 5080, followed by the 9070 XT at 100 FPS average. The 9070 XT is led by the 5070 Ti by about 16% here, and it leads the 9070 by about 7.5%. Lows for all these cards are comparable in that neither brand has a particular advantage in frametime consistency over the other. Older cards that may be interesting include the 3070 at 61 FPS average, about the same as the 4060 Ti, 2080 Ti, and 5060. On the AMD side, the 9060 XT is just ahead of that and alongside the 7700 XT. 4K Ultra is next. The top of the chart comes down to 124 FPS average with the RTX 5090 FE now, and everything else gets trimmed below it. The 7900 XTX remains competitive from AMD. The 9070 XT is now almost tied with the 5070 Ti, but still just behind it, and the 9070 is about the same as the 5070 here. Owners of the 3080 will see performance similar to a 5070, with the new 9070 GRE not far behind. Things get worse from there without any tuning, of course. The 3060 runs at about the level of the modern 5050, except that the 3060 was actually kind of a respectable card, and the 1080 Ti manages to hang in there at 18 FPS average. It's not playable, but honestly, it's better than we'd expect of the Pascal flagship now 10 years on. Not bad for the 1080 Ti. This chart is with ray tracing enabled, the cinematic graphics preset rather than Ultra, 4K, and tested with the few cards that can kind of do it. We also threw our max graphics settings test with the 5090 on here just for comparison to put it somewhere. That involved enabling DLAA and ray reconstruction alongside max lighting, so it's not comparable to any of these other cards here other than the 5090 entry, and that comparison is only that maxing the graphics out at the next step cost about 70+% of the performance. As for the comparable items, the 5090 ran cinematic with RT at 111 FPS average, followed by the 5080 at 72. That means the 5090 has a lead of 56%, the 7900 XTX ran at 60 FPS average, and the 9070 non-XT at 46, the 5070 about the same as that. We also did this at 1440p. In this test, the 5090 ran at 171 FPS average, leading the 5080 by 47%. The 7900 XTX was below the 5080 and led the 9070 XT by about 16% here. The 5070 Ti sits between. One last note for RT on versus off differences. So as we said earlier, for most of the cards, we were not seeing a difference beyond a couple FPS. The 90 series, 50 series, and 40 series, no real difference RT on versus off. It was like a couple frames worse with it on. But one exception to that was we did do a quick test on the 7900 XTX with RT on versus off. And in that instance, we saw almost up to 8% improvement by turning RT off. So in that situation, you wouldn't really be able to compare results of testing with RT on versus RT off for some of these GPU generations. I mean, you shouldn't anyway, but in this case, the scaling is greater with an older generation card like a 7900 XTX. We didn't go back to the 20 series or the 30 series. Presumably, you might see more scaling there as well. But certainly for AMD, they had the largest gain in RT performance relative to themselves in the 90 series versus the 7000 series. So that's it. That's as much as we could get done inside the launch window that we had. Sometimes we get early access to this stuff. Sometimes we don't. I kind of prefer not, just because it seems like these companies always ship a day one patch. There's always a concern of like, has this changed anything performance-wise? I kind of doubt it's any serious changes. I mean, for those who did run tests early, probably not a lot has moved in terms of the frame rate, but Pearl Abyss, for whatever it's worth, did claim that they made some performance optimizations. We don't have before data, but we do have the launch data at least. That's what you've got. And then as far as Intel, I mean, as soon as their ARC GPUs work in this, we'll test them. It's just, from Intel, this is the most direct I've ever seen Intel be in relation to another business, like a partner, where they just straight up said, yeah, Pearl Abyss didn't let us do anything. They wouldn't help us, we couldn't help them. And it's super direct from Intel. They said they didn't get access. They gave or offered Pearl Abyss all kinds of engineering resources, which should normally be programmers, shader programming, stuff like that from their team, and then hardware drivers. And it sounds like I don't know, for whatever reason, Pearl Abyss just did not work with them. Now, Pearl Abyss, this is an AMD-sponsored title, but obviously they worked with NVIDIA, but NVIDIA has 95% of the market, so I don't know. NVIDIA also owns part of Intel, though, so you'd think maybe through that chain. But anyway, ARC is still getting the short straw. That's what I'm saying. It's a lot of words to say. Intel ARC continues to get picked on in the GPU market. Like, in the CPUs, they fucking deserve it, all right? They stagnated for like 8 years or something. They deserve getting picked on in the CPUs and bullied a little bit. But in the GPUs, like, come on. What did ARC ever do to you, Pearl Abyss? maybe they're really mad about Skylake still. 14 nanometer plus. Yeah, the game's got, I don't know. I was reading some of the Steam reviews to try and see how widespread issues are. There were a lot of complaints about pop-ins. That seems to be consistent with how we felt about it. I saw some people also trying to tune it and saying that the settings file either didn't have the option or was hashed, or the option was not obvious to them. And then I did see a number of people complaining about crashes as well online, so that seems like that wasn't exclusive just to us. And just to be clear, once again, that was on 3 different computers with 2 different GPU vendors. So it's not a computer problem. Like this, it was consistent, and it was on different GPUs as well. So I don't know. I think they were not ready for launch, but that seems to be the default state for video games these days. So it's happening again. I don't know what card. Those are the cards I've tested so far over there. I don't know what card this is, maybe 6 or 7. It's happened twice now. This is a 5080 this time. Last time was a 60 something or other. And yeah, looks pretty good. I like the graphics. I think that looks like the DLSS 5 slop filter. Oh, whoa. It went away. Would this be a valid test run if I run it? Or do I need to wait another 5 minutes to load the fucking save file? Anyway, I don't know how fun the game is or isn't. We're just here to test it for this one. And what we found is that medium, high, and ultra settings don't differentiate too much. Ray tracing on versus off was a very slight performance cost with it on. It was like, I don't know, maybe 4% was the most we saw. Cost, meaning performance goes down with RT on, which you would expect. We did test with it off so that we could accommodate the 10 series without any issues. Maxing out the lighting setting costs a ton in performance, so if you're the type of person who wants to just basically max all the settings and it's too heavy for performance, the first thing to change down would be lighting, and you leave everything else up, and that gains you, I mean, it's like 30-40% in some cases. So it's a pretty big impact for that particular setting. And otherwise, that's it for now. I mean, we can do more on this. I wanted to get something out relatively early with the limited time we had for testing. Did that just change color? And you can post your comments below if you have anything specific you want us to test otherwise for this game. But Let us know what you think of the simulation time error charts, previously known as animation error. Really excited about those. We've got a lot of work to do on them still. They are experimental charts, so we're still developing those. And yeah, subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, patreon.com/gamersnexus. And my thanks to Patrick on the team for coming in to help me develop the test plan and do the test design. He sat with me as we worked through the game and figured out what its performance is like. Mike and Tannen for coming in and relieving me of the testing duties as soon as I got in the morning. And then, because I was up all night running the tests solo, they took over for me, so thank you. And then Vitaly and Tim for pushing through on the edit and getting that done so that you all have this great video. So thanks for watching. Subscribe for more. We'll see you all next time.